And we all give our Zoom consent that we know so well now. So hi everyone, thank you so much for being here. My name is Ashley. I'm one of the fellow directors at the USC Global Policy Institute, which is a student-run think tank at USC with faculty director Stephen Lemmy, who's on this call right now too. Our institute puts together programming events such as this one for the GPI community, as well as putting on editorial research content on our website. As many of you know, this Saturday, February 20th, is the International Day of Social Justice, as declared by the United Nations in 2007. So along with this keynote event that we're having right now, please be sure to check out the special editorial project on our website, where our fellows have written on a diverse range of social justice issues in honor of this week. And as such, we're excited to begin this event and welcome Dr. Sally Roever, who's the International Coordinator at WIEGO, which stands for Women in Informal Employment, Globalizing and Organizing. WIEGO is a global research, policy, and advocacy network focused on empowering poor, especially women, who are securing their livelihoods in the informal economies around the world. WIEGO promotes equal economic opportunities, rights, protection, and voice for workers. The organization was founded in 1997 and now has membership in over 40 countries. Dr. Roever has 20 years of experience studying the ways in which laws and politics shape informal global workers' organizations. She's currently located in Washington, D.C. and graduated from the USC School of International Relations in 1994. And she received her PhD in political science from UC Berkeley in 2005. So if everyone could give a warm welcome to Dr. Roever. Thank you so much for being here. And we're going to start this, or we're going to run this event, just so everyone knows, we're going to do some moderated questions between me and Dr. Roever, and then we're going to open up to audience questions that anyone may have for her. Additionally, we'll be dropping our website information in the chat later, so just keep an eye on that. And let me get Dr. Roever unmuted. Hey, Mia, do you have the capabilities to unmute Dr. Roever? Okay, great. So hi, Dr. Roever, how's your day going?
I'm great, thanks so much, Ashley.
Yeah, thank you for being here. So I want to start by helping our attendees of this event visualize the importance and the impact of your work. So before assuming the role as the international coordinator at WIEGO in 2018, you worked with the organization since 2005 in various roles. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about your path to WIEGO and where your passion for working for the rights of informal workers originated during your education.
Sure. So I guess where I would start off is by saying I never would have known at the time that when I started at USC in 1990, that I would have ended up sort of finding a home in a feminist labor rights organization. So part of it is like having the experience of going through a liberal arts education, being able to explore, different themes, different topics, and all that sort of gave me ideas to work with and like a direction to go in. But I started as an IR major, and I think I knew I was interested in doing international work, but I didn't know exactly what to do in the context of international work. I was intrigued by, the rest of the world, wanted to sort of see it all, but didn't know what the pieces were going to be. And then I think, by the time I had gotten through, to maybe my junior and senior years, I started to kind of see a pattern of the things that I found really interesting. So things like, in one of Dr. Lammy's foreign policy classes, we did a unit on bilateral development cooperation. I think I had to analyze the kind of aid program of Denmark or something. I found it fascinating. How do you, how is development aid or development cooperation used as a tool of foreign policy? And so that's sort of, it's kind of pointed me towards development issues. And then another class I remember was Dr. Brand's class on, I think it was a Middle East politics class, where we looked at water as a resource and how the scarcity of water as a resource, as a fundamental resource in that region kind of shapes everything. It shapes politics, it shapes everyday life and all that. So I kind of started with exposure to these development questions, which I found fascinating because they're kind of so seemingly complicated and intractable, you know, the puzzle of global inequality and some of these concrete issues. And then in graduate school, I think I kind of honed in on the informal economy as one aspect of that. So, you know, probably more or less for the same reasons, because it just presents a huge kind of seemingly intractable puzzle, right? How do you develop an economy where 90% of workers are employed informally? So it's that kind of puzzle intrigued me. And then I think it was also, you know, kind of especially during and also after my time at USC, I've discovered by kind of being in South Central Los Angeles that I loved kind of urban public life. That was a new thing for me. So I'd grown up in Eastern Missouri. You could say life is fairly predictable in that setting. And I just found LA to be fascinating. And I loved being out kind of on the streets, kind of hearing what ordinary people have to say about things. And so I think that experience of you know, just being in that setting kind of helped form maybe an inclination to eventually study street vendors in order to learn more about the informal economy kind of from ordinary people. And so I think it's those things that led me into the world of kind of economic rights and economic justice, because they immediately become sort of front and center when you listen to workers in the streets kind of talk about what they're up against.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's something that distinguishes you from many other professionals in advocacy is this kind of philosophy of learning from the experiences of ordinary people and gaining that firsthand knowledge in the communities that your work intends to serve. And I was wondering, when you were pursuing your doctorate in Peru and you were able to kind of research street vending and its local governance firsthand, how did it shape kind of your educational period, being able to do such firsthand research during your doctorate?
Yeah, I mean, it would be kind of hard to find words to express just how important it is to have, or how important it was to me to have that kind of experience of sort of spending every day kind of out in the streets, hearing, watching, listening to kind of everyday life for a typical street vendor in, you know, in a city like Lima, where I was doing my field work. So it was one of those experiences where, like they tell you when you get into a graduate program, you're going to spend a lot of time writing a perfect prospectus. And then if you are doing field work, you know, by the end of your first week in the field, you will sort of tossed it into the recycling bin. And that was definitely my experience. You know, you don't know what you don't know. If you're planning a project where you're like really intentionally open to learning and exploring and kind of understanding in depth, and that sort of depth can only really come from spending a huge amount of time in these communities. And I think one of the really interesting lessons I learned was, you know, the project relied completely on kind of the goodwill of street vendors and their kind of willingness to talk to me. And so, you know, at the time, I couldn't offer really anything in return except just my kind of time and willingness to listen. And there were some who weren't willing to trust kind of a researcher, outsider. I was obviously a foreigner. And so right from the beginning, it, you know, sort of, I learned how important it was to kind of develop trust over time and just how much work that requires to kind of, so you go in kind of thinking, okay, I'm going to, you know, I've got this set of questions, I'm going to try to get to this many respondents, you know, and you learn over time actually that, you know, this really getting to an understanding of a world, an economic world, just requires, you know, repeat visits. It requires a lot of listening, and it requires just a lot of trust building over time. And so I think that kind of experience of going about the project in that way kind of then probably shaped the subsequent choices I made about kind of how to use what I learned, and again kind of led me into the world of where WIEGO sits, which is very much about kind of putting our members, the worker organizations, right at the center of everything we do, and kind of everything we do is relies on those sorts of relationships of trust that you just can't really know and feel and understand until without that sort of an experience.
Yeah, that's very insightful. It seems like the interpersonal relationships were really crucial in your work. Um, I want to also hear kind of your experience and perhaps an explanation for some people here who aren't as familiar with the informal economy in general. And the niche that WIEGO works in is perhaps one of the most successful tools that developing economies can implement to make economies that work for everyone, and including the informal economy rather than stigmatizing it can increase participation and safety in the economy. And I think that is definitely going to be one of the most important tools in addressing widespread poverty that a lot of countries are facing. I'm hoping you can just kind of expand on that brief introduction of the informal economy and explain why it's so important that informal workers must be recognized, valued, and supported in their economies.
Okay, sure. So I think there are probably two ways of answering that question of why it's important to recognize and to value informal workers. So on the one hand, there's like a normative answer that is about rights and justice, that we can't get to a more equitable economy until basic rights are realized. And what that means is every worker, regardless of circumstance, and especially including sort of the most marginalized and most vulnerable workers, must have their voices heard. They must be represented in decision-making structures. They must have the right to organize. They must have the opportunity to participate meaningfully in political life. So you can't get to decent working conditions for everyone without the effective protection of basic rights. And getting to basic rights requires voice, because rights aren't just handed out, right? They have to be fought for, they have to be won. So that's kind of the normative answer to why it's necessary. And then there's also sort of a more like maybe technical or theoretical answer that's about development. How do economies develop, and what does employment have to do with that, with how you develop an economy? So I think the starting point for both, if we're talking about the informal economy's importance to tackling poverty, is to understand employment as a key pathway out of poverty. So what we are focused on is one piece of the puzzle. It's working poverty, problems faced by people who work, but who are facing circumstances where they're unable to work their way out of poverty. So of course there are other aspects of poverty, right? There's nutrition, there's education, there's all manner of things. But the part of poverty that we work on is this issue of how to create better conditions for people who are working. So in relating that to that question to the issue of representation, I think what we have to keep in mind is what it actually means to work in the informal economy and what the employment structure actually looks like in most countries of the world, because it doesn't look like it looks in this country, right? Most countries, the majority of countries, look quite different. So in most countries of the world, the informal economy is sort of the real everyday economy. Most people work in the informal economy. So it's not that it's exceptional or unusual. It's actually more of a norm. And what's exceptional is kind of the formal employment that's essentially a creation of, white male industrial wage workers located in the global north during a certain historical period, which was the industrial era, right? So that's actually an exception if we're looking kind of historically and geographically. So how to relate the role of informal workers' representation and voice to the question of how economies develop, again, has to do with understanding so what the employment structure actually does look like. So if you take it, let's say a typical low-income country might have 90% of its workers might be in the informal economy, but within that, what does it look like? What are they doing? What kinds of enterprises are they working for? Who are they working for? Do they have an employer? You know, what is the employment relationship that they're in? And that's why we need voice, because actually a lot of this kind of standard policy interventions that come to mind for, you know, for growing enterprises are things like, if you want to grow enterprises, you can think of, you know, very common things. So microcredit, training, skills training, you know, small micro enterprise support, those sorts of things. But if you look at what the employment structure actually looks like, those things are relevant only to really a tiny proportion of people who work informally. Most of them are in circumstances where they wouldn't benefit from those sorts of interventions. So that's why you need to have voice of different occupational groups, of different, you know, people who work in different segments of the informal economy, to bring visibility to the working conditions and the challenges that they're facing.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I feel like your explanation, obviously from working in it for so long, was very useful in my understanding of it too. I also am interested to hear about your thoughts of advocacy for the informal economy through the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And I know they often go hand in hand, each of the goals, but I think the ones that most stand out to me are, of course, the end to all poverty and the gender equality. But interestingly enough, I wanted to discuss with you what was a successful governmental policy for the informal economy in the UN, which was the New Urban Agenda, which technically fell under Goal 11 for the UN, which was sustainable cities. But the shared vision of the New Urban Agenda was to achieve gender equality and empower all women and girls to ensure their full and effective participation in leadership and decision-making, which was a really phenomenal agenda that was passed. And I wanted to hear your thoughts on the importance of approaching social justice issues interdisciplinary and using different fields to come up with policy.
Okay, so well, I'm glad you asked about the New Urban Agenda. It happens to be one of my favorite sort of international norms, and it's partly because there are actually a few sentences in there that I wrote, but at the time we sort of got involved in the process. We had no idea like whether or how we would have any influence at all over the content of the New Urban Agenda. So it's kind of a fun story and sort of a lesson to you know, to think about in terms of how these international norms actually sort of come into existence. So if you're coming into one of these processes from the side of civil society, you're sort of flying blind. You don't know exactly how you're going to end up influencing the content of it, right? And so this was one of those kind of examples. So for background, the New Urban Agenda it's an international norm that was adopted by UN member states at the Habitat 3 conference in 2016. That's a conference. Habitat is a conference that happens every 20 years. On the process side, our network had some experience in supporting worker delegations at the annual conference, which is the World Urban Forum. So for several years before Habitat 3, we had been supporting delegations of workers to come to the World Urban Forums and sort of bring a face to discussions of the informal economy and informal settlements and things like that. So we had some experience with that. But when the New Urban Agenda was being conceived, we had no idea kind of what to expect with regard to the actual drafting of the policy. So we kind of made a bet and decided to kind of go all in and try to kind of infiltrate all of the processes just to see whether it would sort of influence the content of that norm. So we actually had this matrix that had like inside track strategies, which was stuff coming from the UN meetings and, you know, all kinds of things coming from the UN, the formal UN process. And then we had an outside track that was like all the things that our civil society allies were kind of planning in parallel. So on the inside track, one of the early steps was that UN Habitat commissioned issue papers, and there was an issue paper on the informal economy. So we contributed to put a lot of time into kind of trying to shape the content of that issue paper. And there were, I don't know, 10 or 20 issue papers. And then from the issue papers, we learned at the time, they then put out a call for names to join policy units. So these were there were 10 policy units and there were 20 people per unit. And we sort of got our people placed in 3 of the 10 units. So I was on the unit for the right to the city. And then we had a lot of civil society allies in those units too. So within the units, we worked with our allies to sort of influence the text of policy papers, which were the output for that process. And again, we didn't know, like, are these papers going to sort of sit on a shelf, or, you know, will they influence in any way? We didn't have any inside kind of view of how the actual agenda would be drafted. But as it turned out, the text of those papers was actually used in the drafting of the new urban agenda itself, luckily for us. So that was one of many, you know, kind of ways of engaging in the whole process, but putting all of the pieces together, all of the spaces that we tried to occupy, we and other grassroots organizations unquestionably kind of influenced the text itself, and some of the references in there to women, to grassroots communities, to excluded groups, and to informal workers. So the text, we managed to, you know, slip in phrases and things like that that would hopefully be helpful to some of our constituents. And then in terms of like how important it is as an international norm for social justice outcomes, it's one of several norms, and the importance of each kind of varies by worker group or by occupational sector. So the sector that has found the new urban agenda most useful, coming from the informal economy, is street vendors. And that's because, you know, street vendors work in urban public space, and the new urban agenda has a lot to say about public space, because different people from our network were sort of, again, kind of in the process trying to influence what it would say. So StreetNet International, there's a global alliance of street vendor organizations across 50-something countries. So StreetNet has encouraged its national affiliates to use the new urban agenda as a tool for pressuring local governments to comply with the spirit of the text that's in that tool. So that's how kind of it becomes useful for a group whose kind of everyday economic life is inextricably kind of connected to all the themes that the new urban agenda touches on. But then if you consider like domestic workers, for example, they don't really deal with local governments, and they don't work because they have employers, so they're mostly dealing with their employer, and they don't deal with public space because they work in private homes. So for them, the new urban agenda is less important, and what's more important is the ILO conventions. So ILO Convention 189 on domestic work, and 190 on violence and harassment in the world of work. And then for like multi-sector groups that you know kind of combine different worker groups, you know, something like ILO recommendation 204 on formalization would be the most relevant because it talks more about process and things like that, and formalization overall. So all of these norms are, I would say, above anything else, important organizing tools, because particularly for the global networks and the regional networks, because they can be used to galvanize national and local organizing and advocacy to pressure governments to comply with the commitments that are written into these norms. And they become useful tools because informal workers are present, are in the room when they're being drafted. And that's the case, I would say, for all of those norms.
Building off that, the importance of international norms and international policy for the protection of informal workers can probably not be overstated. And I'm curious if there are any kind of like large, even if it's kind of like any large things that you would like to see and happen in governmental policy that could protect workers even further. I guess maybe any like dream policies that like you would like to see passed.
I don't know. That's a good question. I don't know if there's any one dream policy. I think right now, so if we're thinking about the time frame for the SDGs, right? And sort of what's happened in the past year, I think actually that what is going to be needed is a mix of kind of short-term and more medium-term policies, especially with the impact of COVID on workers everywhere. And I think actually that in thinking about what needs to inform the orientation of both short-term and long-term policies, I'm seeing inequality, the issue of inequality kind of taking a position kind of alongside or maybe even slightly more prioritized than poverty itself. And that's because of current global trends on both the economic and political side. So if you look at global trends on inequality within countries is rising in all regions. So the kind of concentration of wealth and power within countries is on the rise. And so is sort of popular resentment towards that excessive concentration of wealth and power. So policy in the next kind of while to get us anywhere close to the bar that the SDGs have set needs to focus on inequality, and especially kind of curbing that extreme concentration of wealth at the top and kind of the related lack of accountability on the part of actors who are driving the trend and benefiting from it. So what that means, I think, is working towards policies and frameworks that move the needle towards more equitable distribution. And again, that will need to take place, particularly because of the impact of COVID, both in the short term and in sort of, in the more medium and long term. So right now, the situation is really quite dire for much of the global population. So for sure, short-term pro-poor measures are needed for recovery. Even continued relief measures are needed in many places. But there's also a need for kind of the sort of broader and bolder approaches that I think you're hinting at. So a couple of examples of those, I would say one is that we're a part of is the Global Coalition for Social Protection Floors. So that's advocating for, alongside like 200 and something civil society organizations and trade unions, are calling for national social protection floors that are supported where necessary by a global social protection fund. So what that would mean is things like universal access to essential healthcare services, universal access, so everyone can access essential healthcare services, and also basic income security over the life cycle. So they're not like measures that would solve everything, but they would just put some basic, again, it's a floor. So they would put some basic protections in place as a floor And that would require a global approach to financing, which would mean, again, kind of curbing excessive concentration of wealth and redistributing resources to where they're needed. So that's I think one example of the type of policy space that that I think will be very important in the next little while. And then another example, you know, some of the other measures that we're looking at are more, again, kind of specific to different types of workers in different situations. So to give another example, we work with home workers who are sort of subcontracted industrial outworkers who are in global supply chains. And one of the things that we're working on is kind of ramping up pressure for countries to enact legislation to conduct for corporations to conduct due diligence in their supply chains in order to remediate labor rights violations and human rights violations. So part of that is, last week we supported, I think, 10 national homeworker organizations to submit a platform to the European Commission, because the European Commission is looking at exactly this kind of a framework for requiring member states to create legislation that would require these due diligence. So it's this type of like holding corporations accountable for some of the abuses and the excessiveness of the abuses that I think has to be part of the equation in the next couple of years.
Thank you for sharing your thoughts on that. That was very insightful. I have one more question before we're going to open up to the audience questions. So audience members, if you have a question, feel free to raise your hand in the next minutes or so, or type it in the chat. But the last question that I had for you, and thank you so much, I've really enjoyed having this conversation with you, is leading up to this event, I listened to the recent podcast you recorded with WIEGO that audience members, if you're interested, it's on the WIEGO website. And Dr. Roever did a really excellent job of explaining some of the new challenges to the informal economy in the past year as a result of COVID-19. And obviously, as you said, there are so many areas of the world that have been impacted in this past year. And I just kind of wanted to hear how your work has changed in the past year, and if there were any kind of like big triumphs or challenges that you overcame or are trying to overcome. And yeah, just hearing about, I guess, how your work has changed this past year.
Okay, sure. Yeah. I mean, I guess, you know, on one hand, the objective, we still pursue the same objectives as we always have, and we still kind of operate according to the same principles. So what we do and why, that part kind of hasn't changed and won't change. But the challenge of doing it under these conditions has been massive, for sure. So obviously a lot of the work that we do, you know, is in person. So we're accustomed to, you know, holding workshops and policy dialogues and, you know, all kinds of things, training, all kinds of things that are in person. So of course, you know, not being able to be like physically present in the lives of the workers we support has been a huge challenge in a lot of ways. I guess, you know, maybe just thinking about one kind of project as an illustration, I could point to the study that we've conducted in the first year. So WIEGO has, just backing up for a second, WIEGO has 3 membership constituencies. So we have worker organizations, which are our institutional members, which are global and regional networks of informal workers in different groups, so street vendors, waste pickers, domestic workers, home-based workers, and so on. And then we also have constituencies that include researchers and statisticians and development practitioners. And so it's a network that brings together these 3 memberships in support of, or membership constituencies in support of workers. And so one of the things we do in the normal course is to co-design studies with our partner organizations. So early on in the pandemic, like in, you know, already in April, maybe even March, there's a clear demand for us to do an impact study that would kind of evaluate the impact of the pandemic on workers. And we ended up deciding quite early on to do it in 12 cities. So we've done many studies before, but designing a study in 12 cities without being able to leave our houses was like, you know, building a plane while you're flying it. Every single aspect of what we did was, you know, was different. And so we wanted to get the study into the field like as quickly as possible, because we knew that doing that was essential for that kind of trust building that I was talking about earlier. So it's important for people to hear from us and to know that we want to understand what's happening, how their lives are being affected. So we had to really quickly mobilize a study team and do all manner of kind of troubleshooting around all kinds of things under a huge amount of pressure, given how kind of extreme the crisis was in the early days. So I think, you know, just being able to pull it off, we've now got most of the first round reports are done across the 12 cities. The number of, I can't even remember how many languages, you know, we were operating in, troubleshooting all kinds of, you know, technical issues and things like that. So there were all kinds of like technical challenges, right? But then there were also like just the emotional challenges. So like asking certain questions was, I think for our fieldwork teams was just hard, like in a different way than it ever had been before. So for example, our survey questionnaire had a few questions on whether anyone in the household was experiencing hunger. And in some cases, our local teams knew very well that people were going hungry, but when they went to do the interviews, the study participants sort of weren't ready to say that. And so they would say, no, we're fine. You know, we're getting by. And so, you know, things like that were just really hard on all sides, because, you know, our researchers knew, our local teams knew that it wasn't really the case. But of course, you know, it's early on and people just get by and they're not ready to, you know, not ready to necessarily to sort of go into that. So I think, you know, it's those sorts of things that, you know, when you work alongside a membership constituency for, you know, on an ongoing basis, that was, you know, that was a tough challenge for our local teams. And, you know, just the severity of the whole thing sort of came out of nowhere. And the you know, just the impact on the community we serve has been so disproportionate and so extreme. So I think, yeah, it's been hugely challenging, but I think that you know, sort of being able to find, you know, having a kind of keep going back to the trust issue, but having built those relationships of trust, you know, kind of helped us navigate some of those, you know, some of those things that came up. And so being able to actually pull off a study in 12 cities in a period of 6 months. The last study we did was in 10 cities, and it took us like, I don't know, two and a half years maybe to just get the first reports out. And we did the whole thing in 6 months. So it was a learning experience. And I guess, you know, doing those sorts of things, being able to mobilize, you know, around the crisis and make something happen, hopefully it benefits people in some way and can become a useful advocacy tool, I think would probably be one of our triumphs, as you said.
Thank you for sharing that experience. I feel very thankful to have heard it and to also be celebrating such social justice champions during this week of International Social Justice with you. So we're going to switch over to audience questions now. So Sophie, you can go ahead and unmute yourself.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Dr. Roever, for being here. My question is about the Me Too movement and the role that has in some of the work that you do. So obviously through the Me Too movement, it became increasingly clear that unchecked sexual abuse and harassment runs rampant in the workplace. But obviously, if you're working in the formal workplace, you can sue like arbitration, legal agreements, etc. So I'm wondering specifically within informal systems, what work is being done to support survivors of abuse and harassment to make sure they get justice or can improve their conditions?
Okay, yeah, very good question. Do you want me to take a few questions or answer them one by one?
Whichever one works for you. One by one might be easiest, but if you want to field them, we can do that too.
Okay, no, I can, well, okay, we'll go one by one. That sounds good.
Great.
Yeah, so this is a very good question. I think the most recently, the most significant development was the advocacy for ILO Convention 190, which is Convention to Eliminate Violence and Harassment in the World of Work. And that's an ILO convention that was very much galvanized the informal workers movement, particularly domestic workers who are overwhelmingly women and who work and sometimes live in their employers' homes. And so for them, for the International Domestic Workers Federation, which is the global network of national domestic worker organizations, unions, associations, et cetera, getting an ILO convention passed on violence and harassment in the world of work was a massive priority and a huge achievement because, again, kind of the experience of being able to finding ways of influencing the content of a norm like an ILO convention on violence results in the norm having language that applies to the entire world of work. So you're right, in a formal workplace, filing, let's say, a harassment claim, there would be a process for that. But in an informal workplace, like a domestic worker who lives in the home of an employer who abuses her, what's the process? No one even, there's no labor inspection. There's no, no one knows, and there's no one for her to go to. So for domestic workers, that, and for the International Federation to get a global norm passed that would offer a framework can then create the space for national movements to push for national policy or national legislation rather, that would create a system for pursuing claims and for reducing violence in informal work situations. So that was that I would say is the biggest kind of high level thing that's going on at the global level. And the challenge now is, now that the norm is passed and its wording is kind of nice and broad, it refers to the whole world of work, regardless of workplace and things like that. Now the challenge is to pressure governments to ratify the convention and then to issue legislation and then to hold them accountable for complying with the legislation. So that's the work we have in front of us now.
TK, you can go ahead. Thank you, Dr. Roever.
Hi, Dr. Roever. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today. My question is kind of building off of Sophie's earlier question. When you're trying to face these global norms, how do you balance not only pushing for norms of protecting, especially with WIEGO's mission in protecting women in informal employment, how do you push and advocate for that norm while still respecting the local cultures in each place that you organize and work? And I saw on the website where some focal cities are like Accra, Delhi, Lima, all very different places culturally. So how do you balance both protecting women in informal employment, but also respecting the respective cultures of each location?
Right. So it's another excellent question. So what we do is, let me just say one word about structure. So WIEGO is a global organization, again, with the three membership constituencies. Our institutional members are global and regional networks of different worker groups, and then they have national affiliates and sometimes local affiliates. So what we do when we're entering a global policy process is to hold workshops beginning from the lowest level. So we'll hold maybe local or national workshops to put the issue on the table. So before ILO recommendation 204 on formalizing the informal economy, we convened, raised the funds and convened workshops maybe at national and regional level so that worker organizations at those level can at those levels can bring their perspective on what an international norm should look like from their perspective. So then the national organizations kind of bring their perspectives up to the regional workshops, and then in regional workshops we create regional sort of platforms of demands or priorities, right? And also according to worker groups. So it's not just local culture, but it's also how people are inserted in the labor market will give them a different perspective. Like I was saying, with the street vendors and domestic workers are going to have different views. So because they have different needs, right? So we'll bring together from national to regional platforms, and then bring the regional platforms together into a global platform. And that is a lot of work. It's obviously more complicated than just saying what the platform should be and sending it downward. But what results is kind of a way for a common platform to be formed such that everyone's perspective has been kind of filtered into the whole. So that's kind of how we grapple with that very real kind of conundrum of how you accommodate the different views across different geographies.
Emma, go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. I was just wondering, so I know you briefly said earlier that like the United States is kind of alone in like we have mostly formal workers and less informal workers as compared to like maybe the rest of the world. And I was just wondering if you could briefly touch on like the different challenges that presents in protecting the informal workers as opposed to like a place that's like majority informal workers. I don't, does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. I think so. It's not just the U.S., but really kind of if we kind of use the international classifications of developed countries, you know, emerging countries and developing countries, developed countries will all fall into a similar band of having, you know, so the U.S. and you know, European countries, the percentage of all workers who are in informal employment would be maybe in the range of like, you know, 7 or 8% to like maybe 20% or something like that. And then, you know, emerging countries would be somewhere in the middle, and then developing countries, you know, the most extreme cases, 94, 95% of all workers are in informal employment. So I think where the challenge is that particularly in the kind of global discourses, you know, the centers of power in the world are in like Washington, New York, Geneva, London, right? And the most powerful voices are coming from economies where the informal economy is quite small. Informal employment is quite small. And so there's a particular way of that the informal economy is viewed from the perspective of those power centers. That's something more like, well, the informal economy essentially consists of operators, enterprise operators who are trying to kind of avoid taxes and evade regulation. So there's this kind of avoidance evasion kind of framework that does make sense in like a European context. There are a lot of informal enterprises in Europe that avoid very high taxes and things like that. And just it's those voices or those narratives, that framing of the informal economy sort of dominates the global discussion, and the voices of you know, even sort of policymakers or government officials from developing countries is just not as strong. They just don't have as much power in the global setting. So even in the case of statistics, so we have a statistics program that pushes for official labor force statistics to measure informal employment and to measure it according to an international framework. And even that, in that setting, part of the challenge or part of the puzzle is trying to figure out how the developing country statisticians can get more of a voice in the global statistical discussions of what the framework should look like. And because they're coming from a completely different reality, but one that's actually more common, but also more excluded. So I think that's kind of where the challenge is like, how do you shape the global discourse in a way that just brings a more balanced and kind of more complete picture of whatever it is that you're discussing, whether it's what the international statistical framework should look like, or what a global policy should look like, or whatever. So I think that's it's difficult from for policymakers who are based in the U.S. or Europe and who who wouldn't have any reason to understand what informality looks like in Ethiopia. It's just difficult to see, and so, but sort of by default, because of the power structures, their voices tend to be heavier in these settings. So that's kind of the problem that we try to tackle.
Are there any other questions that people have?
Sally, I'm going to say Sally. So Sally, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit to the students here in terms of, as someone who leads an organization like that is doing some really important work in terms of development and human security in those areas, what would you be looking for people to hire, and what skills and areas would you suggest those students who want to go into an area that you're working in? What should they be mastering? What work should they be doing? What classes, what skills should they be developing?
Yeah, another good question. I think part of the equation for us, and I think for social justice organizations in particular, it might be less important to kind of think about the particular skills and more kind of an intellectual openness to kind of meeting our communities where they're at. That's maybe that's a skill, actually. But like being able to have an orientation where you're open enough to say, you know what, I don't know. Let's suppose I don't know anything, and I just sit here and just listen and observe and ask questions. By being able to do that, you can come to understand what the perspectives are and kind of what the realities are, and then figure out kind of what can I do in this situation, again, to kind of meet this person or this community where they're at, which is sometimes really tough circumstances, right? Like if going into a workshop, wanting to having an agenda in place and wanting to get through, certain agenda items, and then you get there and it's like, it's not going to happen, maybe you're working with a group that's just not ready for an agenda driven meeting format, so then you have to adjust. So it's like having that, I suppose you could call it a skill, but kind of an openness to being able to adapt and again kind of meet people where they're at and not bring in too many kind of biases and assumptions, I think is one thing that's really important. And then and then I would say so yeah, I think that again sort of for students who are wanting to go into the social justice space and into kind of grassroots organizing or those, that sort of a setting, I think that's actually most essential. But of course, there are a lot of different settings. And I think, other kind of more broadly speaking, it's kind of the things that have always been important, right? Like language skills are really important. Being able to navigate languages and languages and cultures, and just being able to, again, kind of have the openness to be able to operate in international settings where you're often taken by surprise in your interpersonal interactions in whatever space that you're in, and really being able to, kind of bringing a certain toughness to having to navigate international spaces, I think is also something. These are things are hard to, like, you can't it would be hard to put these things on a resume. It would be hard for us to like look for them in a resume, but more like in, you know, in interview process or in terms of experience, you know, how finding people who have in one way or another, and it's often by life experience, we end up kind of being a self-selected bunch in a way that people with life experience of, you know, of dealing with hardship or, you know, kind of having to overcome those obstacles tend to be more, you know, more able to navigate these spaces. But again, that's not something you can sort of put on a resume. So, so I think, yeah, I think there's sort of, it's kind of what you bring to it personally in some way, but it's not to say that the kind of traditional sort of hard skills don't matter either. So obviously, like great writing skills, language skills, you know, things like that, a willingness to immerse yourself in complicated problems, you know, things like that are also, of course, timelessly important.
Thank you.
And then our last question will be from Professor Becker, and then Mia, our communications director, will give some quick updates.
First of all, thank you so very much, Dr. Roever. This has really been a very interesting talk and inspirational. I always wrestle with, I teach courses on peace and conflict and you know, corporate responsibility and global politics, and I always wrestle with what we're doing in the classroom and how it relates to the real world. And so as somebody who's gone out, done this work in the real world, and this question is going to put you a little bit on the spot, so I apologize, but I'm just really curious about this. What's one thing, maybe I was going to ask what's the biggest, but I'll just ask what's one thing that we kind of got wrong in the classroom that you wish that we would maybe alter what we do in the classroom to prepare our students a little bit better for going out in the real world and doing the kind of work that you're doing?
Oh yeah, that's a tough one. Partly because I haven't been in a classroom in like 30 years, so I don't know what you guys do in classrooms.
Well, I could cheat and say your classroom, since you never took my class, but you took Steve's, and I can kind of put this, and, you know, put the ball in, you know, in his court. But what's? Am I saying two of those? Yeah. Is there something that you think that maybe we should emphasize? Maybe it's not a mistake, but something that you really wish that we would emphasize in the classroom to prepare our students.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, you are putting me on the spot. It's a good question. I think, I mean, I think one of the things I found to be challenging in the classroom was the sort of problem-based, as a student, I found it challenging to be faced with kind of a problem-based approach. And that was because I didn't have the life experience to really understand what the problems were unless I had happened to have them, right? So some of the problems, so if you're taking a problem-based approach to water scarcity, you know, that's not something I could, yeah, you can sort of grapple with. So I'm just really thinking off the top of my head here. So I think as a student, I struggled a little bit with like understanding how to grapple with problems that I didn't understand, like knowing that I didn't understand them. And so I guess I would wonder, but of course, being on the other side now, I can absolutely see the value, and you can see in the way I think about our work, almost everything I'm talking about is this is a problem, you know, like it's complicated and it's really hard to solve, and you have to sort of think about lots of things. And so yeah, so maybe it will be something around like trying to figure out how to sort of bridge the gap between, again, sort of meeting the students where they are, which is going to be in all different kinds of places, and how to kind of transport them into into a problem, and being able to grapple with it, if that makes sense. So one example is coming to mind actually with, there's an institute in India called the Indian Institute of Human Settlements, and they have an online course for like urban planners, where they have modules that try to, like it's an online, it's a MOOC, I think, and but the modules kind of transport you as a student into a slum, into an Indian slum. So, and I think they have some like VR, you know, kind of video or just videos or something that, so you're sort of on the bus, like bouncing up and down, looking around, and there's dirt and there's rubble and there's, you know, people are sleeping under, you know, whatever, corrugated tin roofs. And so you can sort of see it. So somehow finding a way to like, to do those sorts of things, which are much more possible now technologically than they were back in the day. You know, maybe that would be a way to, yeah, to sort of, again, to sort of make the problem oriented approach to learning, you know, giving people a little bit more to work with. I don't know, that's what came to mind first.
Thank you, Dr. Roever, for answering all those questions. If we could get a round of applause, thank you for everyone who stuck around too. I know we went a couple minutes over. And Mia has some updates too, and then we'll let everyone